Today we will be looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to Australia. Mary Ann McCarthy was born in 1834 in Galway in Ireland during a period of widespread poverty and political tension across the country. Much of the population lived in rural districts, working the land, and living conditions were often difficult. Schooling for poor Irish children was limited, particularly in the countryside, where those who did attend school would only receive a basic education, and instead most children started work as soon as they were able. In the years of Mary Ann's childhood, Ireland was going through a period of overcrowded housing, disputes over land, and increasing conflicts between landlords and tenants. Like many Irish families of the period, her early life took place in a time of economic struggle and social division. In 1849, when she was 15 years old, she was selected to take part in the Earl Grey Famine Orphan Scheme. This was a British government-assisted emigration programme created during the Irish potato famine in the late 1840s that sent thousands of young Irish orphan girls to Australia and was named after Henry Grey, the British Secretary of State for the colonies. During the famine, many Irish families were left destitute, and large numbers of children entered the workhouse after losing parents or being abandoned because their families could no longer support them. British authorities decided that orphan girls from these workhouses could be sent to Australia, where there was a shortage of female workers for roles as housemaids and positions in domestic service, in colonies where men heavily outnumbered women due to transportation and the gold rush. Under the scheme, girls usually between the ages of 14 and 19 were selected from Irish workhouses and given assisted passage to the Australian colonies of New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. After arriving, they were placed in immigration depots and hired out mainly as domestic servants. Around 4,000 girls travelled to Australia under the scheme, and many later married and settled permanently in the colonies. Although Mary left Ireland in 1849, she did not arrive in the colony of New South Wales until February 1850. Upon her arrival, she and other young Irish orphan girls were housed in the former convict barracks in Macquarie Street in Sydney. Although the girls were taken on by local employers, many frequently found themselves in highly vulnerable positions. Once removed from the relative safety of the depot, they were often subjected to abuse, exploitation and mistreatment by masters, who viewed them as cheap, disposable labour. It was within this harsh system that Mary Ann initially secured a position as a milliner. However, the placement was soon cancelled, and her hard-earned wages were entirely withheld, under a vague allegation of disobedience, a common tactic used by employers to exploit young immigrant domestic workers without paying them. Despite these early hardships, she moved on to work in the house of a wealthy family, and this provided her with shelter, a modest income, and experience in her new environment as she adjusted to colonial life. Mary Ann married twice during her years in the colony. Her first marriage took place in Bathurst, where she married George Cooper. At the time, Bathurst was one of the largest inland settlements in New South Wales, serving as an important centre for trade, farming, and travel beyond the Blue Mountains. Little is known about the relationship, even though records state that the marriage did not last, and later it was recorded that she went to Dubbo, a growing settlement in central west New South Wales, where she met and married a man named Edward Young. By the early 1870s, Mary Ann and Edward were living in Gulgong during the height of the gold rush. Following the discovery of gold in the district, thousands of miners, labourers, traders and shopkeepers had poured into what was once a quiet settlement in search of fortune. In only a few years, Gulgong had been transformed into one of the busiest goldfield towns in New South Wales, and now its dusty streets were lined with tents, timber shops, hotels, boarding houses, and makeshift businesses, struggling to keep pace with the sudden growth in population. Edward worked as a butcher and a shopkeeper, supplying meat and goods to miners and local residents, while like many other women living in Gulgong, much of Mary Ann's life was centred around domestic labour, raising children, preparing meals, washing clothes, and managing the household, amid the noise and discord of a mining town. It was not easy, and life in Gulgong during the gold rush years was often difficult. Men greatly outnumbered women. Hotels and illicit liquor houses did constant business. Gambling and drinking were common, and domestic disputes were far from unusual. The town itself was noisy at all hours, with wagons moving through the streets, miners coming and going all the time, and crowds gathering outside hotels and stores late into the night. Like many couples living through the rough mining settlements in the 1870s, Mary Ann and Edward lived under constant strain as they attempted to raise a family and maintain a business. The early morning of Tuesday, the 20th of February 1872, began with a bitter verbal dispute between Mary Ann and Edward at their shop at number 4 North Blacklead in Gulgong. The argument escalated very quickly, and Mary Ann ran outside onto the street, closely followed by Edward. She seemed to be very frightened, but this did not seem to concern Edward, who, after striking her across the face with his open hand, took a horsewhip from the cart outside the shop and started to beat her. Mary Ann ran back into the shop door, but could not fully escape, and Edward continued to beat her. By now her children had come downstairs, and had both started to cry. In a frantic bid to defend herself, and attempt to try and stop the beatings, Mary Ann lunged forwards, and caught Edward by the beard with both hands. He immediately demanded that she release him, and when she did not, he renewed the assault with greater fury, striking her until she was knocked to the ground once more. She was dazed and clung to the wheel of the cart. Edward then stopped, and after looking at his wife, retrieved his hat and made his way back towards the shop. However, the incident was not over, as Mary Ann got to her feet, went into the shop, and as Edward looked through the open door, she took a knife that was laying on the counter and stabbed him in the abdomen. She then heard him groan, and he said, "I'm done," before falling to the ground. The commotion had drawn a bit of a crowd, and bystanders rushed in to see if they could help. Edward was lying on the floor and bleeding from a wound to his stomach. One woman loosened his collar and offered him water, but he looked very vacant and was unable to speak. By 7 a.m, Constable Stapleton arrived at the scene. He entered the house, where he found Edward lying on the floor surrounded by blood. On examining him more closely, the constable realised that he was already dead, while Mary Ann knelt beside the body in visible distress. She seemed to be very regretful for what she had done, and continued to ask for forgiveness. An onlooker at the shop handed the constable a blood-stained butcher's knife, and Constable Stapleton then took Mary Ann aside, cautioned her, and formally charged her with the murder of her husband. Stricken with remorse, she did not attempt to deny what she had done. Instead, she said, "Yes, and I am the person that did the deed. I do not deny it. I did not do it willfully. I did it in the heat of passion. The knife was beside me. I took it, and I stabbed him." She then handed Constable Stapleton the heavy whip handle Edward had beaten her with, and as he looked at her, he noticed that her face, her arms, and her dress were all still bearing the marks of the struggle. News of the killing spread rapidly through Gulgong, and throughout the day groups of people gathered outside the butcher's shop, all discussing the shocking events that had taken place there. Although drunkenness, fighting and disorder were common on the goldfields, murders of this kind were still rare, and many residents were stunned by the violence of what had occurred only hours earlier. The following day, Wednesday the 21st of February 1872, an inquest took place before Coroner Tebbit. He outlined that this had not just been a murder, but a domestic tragedy, and the jury would hear the accounts of those who had witnessed the fateful event. John Duggan was the first to testify. He told the inquest that he had been on his way to work when he saw Edward Young hitting his wife with a horsewhip, and later he saw Mary Ann pulling Edward's beard. He said that he saw Edward knock her down, and then he saw Mary Ann get up and stab him. Further testimony came from Matilda Leonard, who lived opposite the butcher's shop. She said that she heard a fierce altercation between Edward Young and his wife, and saw him beating her with a whip. She also said that she saw Mary Ann grab him in an attempt to make him stop before Edward knocked her against the wheel of the cart. Mrs. Mary Hutchins, the wife of a neighbouring shopkeeper, corroborated this testimony, stating that she ran to her door after hearing screams and saw Edward relentlessly striking his wife with what looked like a horsewhip. And while doing this, Mary Ann was trying desperately to protect herself. Dr. William Ramsey, the local medical practitioner, was the final witness and provided a definitive forensic conclusion. He said that he had examined the body of Edward Young at 10 a.m. on the 20th of February and could confirm that death was caused by an abdominal wound that was 2 inches long and 6 inches deep and had split open the deceased man's liver. The doctor said that this would have caused almost immediate death. All the witnesses confirmed that the couple had long been troubled by jealousy and that there were often quarrels between them. Mary Ann's legal representative, Mr. Clark, argued that while a committal was inevitable, a capital charge of murder could not stand, given the extreme provocation and physical abuse that she had suffered. He advocated that she be committed on the lesser charge of manslaughter. The jury agreed, and Mary Ann Young was formally committed for trial. On Saturday the 16th of March 1872, Mary Ann Young appeared at the Mudgee Court of Sessions, the principal regional criminal court for the Western Districts of New South Wales. Serious offences committed in nearby towns and goldfield settlements, including Goolagong, were always heard there, as Mudgee became an important legal centre during the gold rush years. With thousands of miners and settlers moving through the district, the court dealt with a steady flow of cases, which involved things such as violence, theft and drunkenness, from across the area. The proceedings had much been anticipated by the local community and drew a large crowd of onlookers, all anxious to see how the law would deal with the case that had so deeply shocked Goolagong. The prosecution presented a familiar line of evidence, calling the exact same witnesses who had previously spoken at the inquest. Once again, Constable Stapleton recounted Mary Ann's remorseful confession, while neighbours and bystanders detailed the terrifying moments of the assault. Throughout the proceedings, Mary Ann was represented by Mr. Clark, who built her defence around the undeniable severity of the attack that she had endured. He reminded the court how Mary Ann's husband had struck her and then beaten her with a horsewhip. He argued that her actions were those of a terrified woman pushed to her limits, and tried to focus the jury's attention entirely on the immediate severe physical assault his client had faced, arguing that the knife was taken up entirely as a desperate act of self-defence during a brutal beating from her husband. In colonial Australia during the early 1870s, cases of wives killing their husbands were viewed with a mix of social fascination, public scandal, and strict legal attitudes towards violent crime within a marriage. Under the prevailing British legal framework of the era, a woman who killed her husband had disrupted the established domestic and social hierarchy, meaning the Crown initially pursued such acts as murder. However, the legal system did recognise the distinction between cold-blooded malice and actions taken in the heat of passion under extreme provocation, when severe domestic abuse could be undeniably proven by independent witnesses. As it had been in this case, courts and juries sometimes used the charge of manslaughter as a vital legal mechanism aimed to avoid the mandatory death penalty attached to murder. It allowed the courts to acknowledge the seriousness of taking a husband's life, while extending a degree of understanding to a woman who committed such a terrible crime, purely to survive intolerable violence. The trial of Mary Ann Young lasted only one day, and after both the prosecution and defence had delivered their final arguments, and the judge summed up the case, the jury was sent out to deliberate. When they returned, the foreman announced that they found the defendant, Mary Ann Young, guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. However, he noted that reflecting the public sympathy and the undeniable evidence of her suffering, they accompanied their verdict with a recommendation for mercy, citing the extreme provocation and the brutal physical abuse Mary Ann had suffered at the hands of her husband before the fatal blow was struck. Following the verdict, the judge sentenced Mary Ann Young to 6 months' imprisonment. Not much is known about Mary Ann's life following her release from prison. After the trial, she largely disappeared from the newspaper record. At some point, she eventually settled in Moore Park in Sydney, an area just southeast of the city that by the 1880s was becoming increasingly built up as Sydney continued to expand beyond its older colonial centre. After years spent in inland mining settlements and country towns, Mary Ann appears to have passed her final years in the growing suburbs of the colonial capital. On the 19th of December 1887, Mary Ann died after taking a dose of chlorodyne, a popular laudanum-based medicine that was widely used during the 19th century for pain, sleeplessness, coughs and stomach complaints. She was 53 years old at the time of her death, closing the final chapter on her life that had carried her from Ireland to the Australian goldfields and into the colonial courts after the manslaughter of her husband following an act of domestic violence in 1872. Her case had become quite well known because it reflected the growing willingness of some 19th century juries and judges to distinguish between calculated murder and acts committed by women living under violent and abusive circumstances, an issue that would remain part of legal and public debate for generations to come. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case